You feel it in the split second before you say yes to something that should be easy. Not because it is reckless, not because it is extravagant, just because even a normal adult life now keeps asking you to prove you can still afford to look like one. A dinner without hesitation, clothes that do not quietly say you are falling behind, a phone you do not feel the need to hide, something in your home replaced before it starts looking like neglect. None of this is luxury. None of this is status. None of this should feel like exposure. But it does. Because a lot of people are no longer spending to look successful. They are spending to stop life from looking tighter than it already feels. And that changes the pressure completely. It means the cost is no longer just financial. It is social, psychological, personal. You are not only paying for things, you are paying to keep small signs of strain from becoming visible enough for the world to start reading your life differently. That is why this feels heavier than everything is expensive. What is getting expensive is not just living, it is looking like nothing is wrong. And that is a brutal kind of pressure to carry, because it does not come from vanity. It comes from the quiet adult fear of becoming readable in the wrong way, of letting ordinary details start telling the truth before you are ready for them to, of realizing that people can often sense when life is tightening around someone long before that person ever says it out loud. That is why this issue cuts deeper than people admit. If this were about showing off, it would be easier to dismiss. If this were about wanting too much, it would be easier to moralize. But most of the time, that is not what is happening. Most people are not trying to look impressive. They are trying to avoid looking like their life is slowly losing softness, flexibility, and room. That is a very different kind of burden. You see it in the way ordinary choices start arriving with private tension attached to them. Not dramatic tension, not panic, just that low, constant friction that shouldn't be there. The friction of knowing that small things no longer stay small once they touch the rest of your month. A simple plan is no longer just a plan. A basic replacement is no longer just a replacement. A pair of shoes is no longer just a pair of shoes. A phone, a jacket, a dinner, a repair, a household item, a small moment of social participation. Each one now drags a second question behind it. Not, do I want this? But what else gets tighter if I do this? Not, is this reasonable? But can I absorb what this means once it connects to everything else? That is how normal life starts losing its neutrality. And once normal life stops feeling neutral, you stop moving through it naturally. You become more aware of timing, more aware of what still passes, more aware of how long something can be stretched before it becomes visible. You notice how much of adult life is made of tiny signals people are not supposed to talk about. The signal of clothes that still feel current enough. The signal of replacing things before they start looking tired. The signal of saying yes without hesitation. The signal of a home that still looks maintained instead of managed. The signal of not carrying too much visible delay. None of these things are supposed to define a person, but they do affect how a person is read. And that matters more than most people want to admit, because adulthood has social codes, quiet ones, unspoken ones, codes about what should still feel easy by now, codes about what a stable life should look like from the outside, codes about what kind of maintenance should happen invisibly, without friction, without delay, without your whole internal budget feeling the impact of it. That is why this pressure feels so lonely. It is hard to describe without sounding superficial. If you say you are tired of calculating how normal you can afford to look, it sounds shallow. If you say you are exhausted by the cost of keeping your life visually coherent, it sounds dramatic. If you say that small visible details have started carrying too much emotional weight, people hear appearances, they hear ego, they hear consumerism. They do not hear what is actually underneath it. Dignity. Not luxury, not status. Dignity. The desire to move through ordinary life without feeling like every visible part of it is becoming evidence. The desire to buy something basic without feeling like you are authorizing pressure somewhere else. The desire to say yes to something harmless without hearing the rest of the week get tighter in your head. The desire to replace what needs replacing before neglect starts masquerading as personality. That is not vanity. That is what happens when normal life becomes expensive enough to start threatening your social readability. And social readability is one of the most invisible financial pressures adults carry. Because once your life starts getting interpreted through visible clues, you don't just manage money, you manage what your life says. You manage what your home says, what your clothes say, what your delays say, what your hesitations say, what your substitutions say. You start protecting yourself not only from financial discomfort, but from social interpretation. That kind of pressure changes behavior in ways people rarely notice. You become more quiet about preference. You stop volunteering certain ideas. You hesitate before entering environments that might expose too much contrast between what looks normal and what feels manageable. You become skilled at delay without calling it delay. You learn how to make the cheaper option look intentional. You learn how to make the older thing look good enough. You learn how to sound easy while doing mental subtraction in real time. And the more normal you manage to look, the less anyone sees the cost of maintaining it. That is the trap, because success at hiding strain often guarantees that the strain will stay invisible. People only see that you are functioning, that you still show up, that your life still appears coherent, that things are mostly handled, that there is no obvious emergency. So your pressure gets misread as your personality. You start hearing yourself described as simple, practical, easygoing, low maintenance. And maybe part of that is true, but a lot of adults have been forced into a version of simplicity that was never fully chosen. A lot of what gets called being easy is really the result of learning how expensive it is to have visible needs. That is where this starts becoming more serious than it looks, because repeated self-editing doesn't stay financial for long. It becomes relational. You stop entering life with the same openness. You stop wanting things as freely. You stop suggesting. You stop reaching. You become more careful, not because careful is who you are, but because each ordinary expression now has potential consequences attached to it. Spontaneity gets hit first, not because you became boring, because spontaneity needs room. It needs the ability to say yes before calculating the aftershocks. It needs the freedom to enjoy something while it is happening, instead of feeling the rest of your month tighten around it. Once that room disappears, even small pleasures lose some of their softness. Then your sense of ease starts going with it. You become harder to delight in ordinary ways because ordinary life itself has become loaded. A dinner is no longer just a dinner if it connects to 3 other trade-offs. A purchase is no longer just a purchase if it comes with self-surveillance. A repair is no longer just a repair if it confirms that maintenance is now another source of pressure instead of relief. And when enough ordinary moments start carrying extra weight, your whole emotional posture changes. You look more controlled from the outside, but inside you are just more edited. That distinction matters, because from the outside, edited adults often look mature, responsible, grounded, measured. They look like people who have learned not to need much. But from the inside, some of that calm is not peace. It's restriction that has gotten good at hiding itself. It's compression wearing the face of discipline. That is why this kind of pressure is so hard to name honestly. It doesn't look dramatic enough to count as suffering. It doesn't look chaotic enough to count as a crisis. It doesn't look indulgent enough to justify guilt. It sits in a strange emotional category, where everything still technically functions, but more and more of life has to be managed in ways that shrink you while keeping your outline intact. And that shrinking is the hidden cost, not just fewer purchases, a smaller life inside the same life, a narrower range of easy choices, a narrower social presence, a narrower version of preference, a narrower version of participation. You do not only spend less, you become less visible in certain ways, less likely to suggest, less likely to replace, less likely to express, less likely to let normal life happen without first checking whether you can absorb the social and financial consequences of being fully in it. That is not a small thing. Because at some point, the issue is no longer whether life is expensive. The issue is what kind of person you become when ordinary adulthood keeps requiring you to trim yourself to fit inside it. And a lot of people are already living that answer without realizing it. They think they're becoming simpler, but sometimes they are becoming more socially strategic. They think they are becoming wiser, but sometimes they are becoming more cautious because normal life now punishes visible looseness. They think they are becoming lower maintenance, but sometimes they have just learned that visible needs are expensive and invisible needs are easier to carry quietly. That is a different story than money is tight. It is the story of adulthood becoming a performance of stability, even when the private experience underneath that performance is constant adjustment. Not fake stability, performed stability. The effort to keep your life reading as normal while your actual margin keeps getting thinner. The effort to make pressure look like composure. The effort to translate limitation into taste, delay into intentionality, self-denial into maturity. And when that translation goes on long enough, it starts distorting how you see yourself. You stop asking whether you are actually this restrained by nature, whether you are actually this undemanding, whether you are actually less interested in things, less social, less expressive, less particular than you used to be. Because maybe you aren't. Maybe you are just someone who has spent too much time making yourself easier to carry inside a life that has become too expensive to inhabit honestly. That is the deeper wound here. Not that normal life costs money, it always did. It is that normal life now often asks for enough visual maintenance, enough hidden discipline, enough careful self-management that the person trying to keep up with it starts disappearing into the effort. And once that starts happening, the pressure is no longer sitting around your life, it is shaping the way you enter it. It shapes how quickly you say yes, how freely you choose, how comfortably you show up, how much of yourself you reveal, how many ordinary things you allow yourself to want without first converting them into a debate about responsibility. That is why this pressure feels heavier than the numbers, because numbers only tell you what something costs. They do not tell you what it costs to keep your life from being read through that cost. They do not tell you what it does to a person to keep looking stable enough, current enough, maintained enough, calm enough, ordinary enough, while the margin underneath that image keeps thinning out. They do not tell you what it feels like when harmless choices start carrying the emotional weight of exposure. That part never shows up on paper, but it shows up in a person, in the hesitation, in the editing, in the reduced ease, in the way some adults now move through ordinary life as if everything must be handled lightly enough not to reveal the strain that made it heavy. And that is why this is not just about expense. It is about the private labor of staying legible, the labor of making sure your life still reads as coherent, even when it no longer feels that way from the inside, the labor of absorbing tightening conditions without letting them rewrite your social appearance too quickly, the labor of protecting your dignity through maintenance, timing, substitution, and silence. That labor exhausts people because it asks them to carry two realities at once, the reality they live and the reality they have to continue presenting as normal. The cruel part is that the better you get at carrying both, the more likely you are to blame yourself for how tired you are. Because if nothing is visibly broken, then why does everything feel so tight? If you are still functioning, then why do harmless choices keep feeling loaded? If life still looks okay, then why do small things now arrive with so much hidden force? But that is exactly the point. A lot of the weight was never in the thing itself. It was in what the thing threatened to reveal. And once you see that, something important becomes harder to ignore. Some of the pressure you've been translating into personal inadequacy was never just about discipline, priorities, or resilience. Some of it was the pressure of living inside a standard of normal that still acts like it's neutral, while quietly demanding more maintenance, more composure, and more concealment than many people can sustain without becoming smaller inside it. That is why the damage is not only financial, it is interpretive. You start misreading your own caution as weakness, your hesitation as failure, your tighter range as proof that you are somehow less capable than you should be. You look at how much effort it takes to maintain ordinary life and assume the problem must be something defective in you. But some of that effort is not evidence that you are failing adulthood. It is evidence that adulthood, as it is still being socially performed, has become more punishing than the language around it admits. That realization will not lower your bills. It will not create margin by itself. It will not make ordinary life light again overnight. But it does remove one distortion. It stops forcing you to measure your private strain against a public standard that many people are only maintaining through invisible labor of their own. And once that distortion starts breaking, so does a certain kind of shame. The shame that says if small things feel heavy, something must be wrong with you. The shame that says if ordinary life feels loaded, you must be too sensitive, too demanding, too affected. The shame that says a responsible adult should be able to absorb all of this without it changing the way they move through the world. No, sometimes the honest truth is simpler and harsher than that. Sometimes you are not exhausted because you want too much. You are exhausted because even looking like nothing is wrong has started requiring too much.